what have we seen so far? Let's recapitulate. What do we see? That if man does appropriate acts called mitzvahs, then what happens is his existence is sustained. Not only that, but he gets the kedusha flow, which of course sustains his existence. He has access to the yichud of that flow, because the flow from God really means a comprehension of the flow itself. So he can access that yichud, the access to flow itself. So therefore what happens is that flow gives him power, and it gives him hasaga of the yichud of God. And therefore, of course, he's able to promote that, and if it increases to such an extent as a result of his mitzvahs, he actually brings down the Shekhinah itself. We saw on the reverse that if man does not do mitzvahs, instead he does inappropriate acts called chatoim or sins, then that flow, that kedusha, that shefa that would go to man is shunted or diverted to the Satan. Therefore what happens is that he's yonik, he feeds off that power, or he feeds off that kedusha, that shefa, and he is sustained. But what we see now, it's more than he's sustained. He has access to the nature of the kedusha or the flow itself, whatever it is. In other words, he has access to the yichud that is enmeshed in this flow. In other words, he can deny entry of that yichud to the world, or he can distort the yichud, give it to the goyim, and they will then become more advanced, and they will turn around to the Jews and say, we have the truth, you don't, we will therefore persecute you, which of course in truth has been happening. Not only that, but the siluk shechina, the shechina must remove itself. Because if he has power of the yichud, then the shechina, which is the greatest manifestation of yichud, must remove itself. And of course we see that he has the oiz, the power, the hatzlacha of the shefa that comes down. And of course it's terrible things for the Jews. And what I have just illustrated is that this is not a fanciful idea. This idea of the inverse relationship that we have with the Satan is the true explanation for what happens in history. Every time you see goyim go up, you will see that Jews go down. Every time you see that Jews go up, advance, then goyim regress, goyim go down. Why? Because that is the inverse relationship that exists between the Jew and the Satan. Therefore it exists between the Jew and the Goy, who many times is the agent of the Satan. Not all Goyim are the agents of the Satan, but unfortunately many Goyim are into choosing evil, therefore the Satan has shlita over them. He has shlita over the Umas Ha'olam, over the nations themselves. Now, what gives the Satan this awesome power? Is it the sins of the Jews? And the answer is no. The fact that Jews sins cannot give him power. It cannot give him access to the yichud. What gives him access to all this is Lashon Harah. Because without Lashon Harah, he can't be mekatreg. Without a kitrug, he cannot call you, he cannot alert Bezdin. And without Bezdin, he cannot prove you guilty. And therefore, he cannot yonik from the sin. He's got to prove it was a sin. Therefore, ultimately, it is not the chet that gives him all this terrible power. It is the Lashon Harah that is spoken by Jews that gives him this power. In other words, it is mishpat that gives him power, because mishpat implies kitrug, if you remember. In other words, if you do not speak Lashon Harah, he cannot mekatreg. Therefore, he cannot activate mishpat. Therefore, he starves, even though you have chatoim. But then how do you get a kapara? Because then God deals with you himself. And he doesn't have to observe the rules and the regulations of the court, the heavenly court. He can deal with you the way God does, the way a father does a child. He will punish you, but slowly he'll give you a couple of yisurin sufferings to awaken you to do tshuva and so on. When God deals with you, then he will deal with you even if you have no merits, schusim. Because he does not have to follow the rules and regulations of Bezdin. He doesn't have a Satan and prosecutor sitting in front of him demanding his yanika from you. But if you speak Lashon Harah, then the Rebbeinu Shalom himself must accede to the request of the Satan. God must appear in court, so to speak. In other words, the Satan is allowed to makatre because of your Lashon Harah, then the Rebbeinu Shem has to follow the rules that he created once you drag him into court. He has to allow the prosecutor to prosecute, and if you have no merits, and if you have not employed the other defensive strategies I had mentioned, then woe is you. Because not only does he have access, he can punish you, the one who hears the Lashon Harah, and the one who speaks or who it's spoken about, but we now see that he has access to the yanika of the chet, which is much worse than you getting punished. Believe me. Because once he has that, he goes throughout the world and literally begins to destroy the yichud in the world. And as a result of that, that's why Jews have so much persecutions. Not only because of their sins, it's because of the yanika that he gets. Therefore, it is Lashon Harah that gives him kitrug, that gives him access to Bezdin, that gives him access to your sins' consequences, namely the shefa itself. If you don't speak Lashon Harah, then he is powerless, even though you have chatoim. And he becomes impoverished and he dies. It's amazing that Jews can have sins, yet the Satan will die. Because it is only the kitrug. He can only get his yanika by kitrug. That's the only way. He can get it no other way. It's a mind-boggling idea. You really have to think about this, because the significance is awesome to the Jew. In other words, if none of us speak Lashon Harah, even though we have chatoim, he dies. And if he dies, the nations grow weak. And all of a sudden, the Tikburis HaKadosh occurs, where there's no more disease and suffering, there's no dictators, there's no evil, there's no crime, there's no falsehood. There is an enormous amount of spirituality, truth, and of course, health and peace in the world. And besides that, there's an incredible amount of yichud, of the presence of God, the Shekhinah, and of course, once that's here, we have an enormous amount of hasaga. That is what we begin to see. Now, if you think this is all that there is to be discussed, you're wrong. Because the question is, what does a Satan get today? I have talked about history, that because of the Lashon Harah that people spoke in those days, he has access to Kedusha, access to Shefa, the Hashpor itself. He's yonik, he nourishes himself off that Yichud, and he does what he wants. Either he conceals the Yichud from the world, or he distorts it, sends it down, and go and take it to persecute Jews. And of course the Shekhinah must be removed. It sounds like, what else can a Satan do worse than what he's done? And the truth is that what he is doing today is much worse than what he did then. Why? And what is it? Come and hear the true significance of Lashon Harah for the last 1,000 years. That makes the other ideas pale in insignificance. And it's hard to see how anything can pale in insignificance to these ideas. Okay. Let us see what is happening today as a result of Lashon Harah. We see what happened as a result of Lashon Harah then, but what happens as a result of Lashon Harah today? Let us see. We are now going to discuss the last 1,000 years, which differs significantly from the previous 4,000 years, or rather 5,000 years. There is an enormous difference. What is that difference? There is a very strange Zohar. Let's start with that. The reason why I'm saying this, these ideas are not relatively known, and then maybe that's an understatement. The reason why I'm saying this and speaking this way is because you are going to hear truly what is happening, and the hope that people will not speak Lashon Harah justifies my speaking about these incredibly esoteric doctrines, ideas. There is a Zohar that says, there's a pasuk that says, Bi'ito achi shena, which is famous, that God says, I will bring the Mashiach bi'ito, in its time, achi shena, I will hasten it. And that is clearly referring to the Mashiach. Now the Zohar says, it says bi'ito, in its time. So the Zohar says what that really means is bi'es hey, at the time of 5. Be'ez hey, because if you take the word be'ita, it's 2 words, be'ez hey. What does that mean? That at the time of 5, at the time of the year 5000, okay, that's when the messianic lights, the aura of the Mashiach, will begin to come down to creation. There's a certain idea called the Or Mashiach, the revelation of the Mashiach. In other words, what does the Mashiach reveal? What exactly is he going to tell us that is so mind-boggling? That is called the Or Mashiach. That is going to begin coming down in the year 5000. Be'ez hey. Because the Rebbe says, Be'ito achishena. I will hasten it in its time. When is its time? That's marumas or indicated in the word Be'ez hey. Be'ito. In the time of 5000. What does all this mean? Okay. What is the Or Mashiach? You must understand what that is. The Or Mashiach is also called the Or Hagonos, the hidden light, or the Or Rishon, the first light. What does that mean? In the beginning, in Bereshis Bara Elokim, it says that God created the heavens and the earth, right? And the earth was unformed and was void and so on, and it was darkness on the face of the deep. And then it says, and God said, let there be light, Vayom Elokim Yehi, and of course, Vayi, and there was light. And then it says, Vayer Vayivoka, and there was evening and there was morning, Yom Echad, one day. Now, there is a difficulty here. Why? Because in every other place it says the second day, the third day, the fourth day. On the first day, it doesn't say Yom Rishon, the first day. It says Yom Echad, day of one, or one day. Why does the Torah change its Lashon? The way it says. Why doesn't it say first day instead of, like it says in all the other days? Why does it say one day? Now Rashi gives an explanation, and he says the reason why it says Yom Echad, because Yom Echad really means day of one. Because on that day there was no living entity besides God. The angels were created on the second day. Therefore the first day was Yom Echad, Yom Shel Echad, the day of one. The day of the one. And who is the one? God. The Yehuda, right? But on the second day, it says the way it should say, second day, third day, fourth day, and so on. This is Rashi. However, if we begin to look at this idea, there is a pnimius to the Yom Echad that is incredible. The Yom Echad, that two words tells us what the Or Mashiach is. What the Mashiach will reveal. What is Yom Echad? What Yom Echad means this, and that's why it says Yom Echad. If you were around on that first day, watching God create, you know what you would see? You would see the physical universe. You'd see the spiritual universe. But you would see it in a very interesting way. You would see how all of it, the entire creation, emanates from God. It would not be concealed. You would see exactly how an ocean emanates from God Himself. In other words, God as the ultimate cause of the physical universe, God as the ultimate cause of the spiritual universe, would not be concealed from you. You would see the manifestation, or in other words, the physical universe and spiritual universe, and you'd see how they actually emanate from the Ribono Shel Olam, who is the source of the being. Not only that, but you would see how the Ribono Shel Olam, of course, is the ultimate master of all creation, because obviously if He is the source of creation, He clearly is the master of creation too. This is what you would see. That is why it says Yom Echad. It was a day of one. In other words, even if on that day you saw the entire creation, all the myriad multiplicity of different things, it wouldn't fool you into thinking that they were independent existences from God. Because you would see how everything emanates from God Himself. That's why it says Yom Echad, the day of the one. Because on that day, you would know that there is only one thing that exists, God. There is nothing else. You see all the different things in creation, but you see that they emanate from God. So therefore, it's still the day of one. You see that God is the ultimate cause of the world. Not only that, but if you were at that day, you would see God in you. You would comprehend, as I said previously, the truth and the nature of your own emanation from God. You would see how everything, including yourself, emanates from God Himself. That would not be concealed from you on that first day. That, and to merames that, to indicate that in a secretive way, God says Yom Echad, that the first day was the day of one. On that day you could see that God was the source and the master of all being. It was not concealed. And you would see Einod Milvadoi, that besides God there is nothing else. Now, on the second day this was concealed, because it says V'himavdil bein mayim lemoyim, that God made a division, separated between the upper waters and the lower waters. That means God introduced the concept called pirud. He introduced the concept called differentiation. He had now occluded the truth or the relationship that he has with the universe. No more on the second day would you see how the universe and you relate to God. It was hidden. Why? In order to give man a chance to figure that out himself. Now we see, therefore, that Yom Echad means a day of one, that the truth of Yom Echad it determines why it was called Yom Echad. But what does it say on the first day? It says, and God said, let there be light. What is light? Light does not mean that God created light. What that means is that God created the ability of a being to comprehend that he is the source and the master of creation. Light is a metaphor for knowledge. When somebody says to you, do you see the light? He doesn't mean do you see lights. He means you see what the light reveals, which is, of course, wisdom, which is reality. Light is a metaphor for reality. So when it says that God created the light, the or, what he's really saying that he created the light of Yom Echad, the light of the first day, which is the day of the one, that God is the source of all being. In other words, the or that was created in the first day, the or Rishon, the first light, or the or Hagonos, that light which was concealed, refers to that knowledge that a person would have if he existed on that first day. That was concealed from the eyes of all living entities, especially from man. Therefore, we now see that the Or Rishon, the Or Hagonos, is Yom Echad. It's amazing how that when you understand it, the Torah literally says it, of course, but it's of course concealed. The first light, or that knowledge which is the first knowledge and is the only knowledge, is the knowledge of Echad, Yom Echad. The knowledge that we understand that God is the ultimate cause, the source and master of all existence, all creation. That is the Or Mashiach. When the Mashiach comes, he will reveal how every physical phenomena, all science, everything, that physical phenomena emanates from God. Or rather, that all physical phenomena emanates from a spiritual universe. And the spiritual universe itself emanates from God. That is what the Mashiach will reveal. In other words, he will reveal creation totally revealed. That's what he will do. All physical phenomena, he will reveal the spiritual universe, and you will see the relationship between God, the Yichud, and how everything is manifest from the Yichud of the Rebbeinu Shalom. The spiritual from the Rebbeinu Shalom, and we from the spiritual. In other words, the knowledge that we will have of the physical universe will be awesome. We will know the ultimate cause. In other words, we will not fool ourselves in thinking that the physical principles or physical phenomena is determined by physical principles, the way scientists think. We will understand the yichud, that all of it emanates from the spiritual universe which emanates from the Rebbeinu Shalom. That is the Or Mashiach, that is the Yom Echad, that is the Or Hagonos or the Or Rishon. Okay, now we understand at least what the Zohar is referring to, that this Or Mashiach, this Or Rishon, began to come down in the beginning of 5,000. In the beginning of in the year 5,000, it began to come down. But why then? For that, we must understand another idea called the creation clock, which is a different clock than we use. What is the creation clock? It says in Tehillim, Ki elef shonim b'einecha, as 1,000 years, or rather 1,000 years in your eyes, is kiyom esmoel, is as a day that passed. What does that mean? What it means is that 1,000 years in the history of man is the same, is considered to God as one of the days which passed, and that refers to the days of the first week of creation. Therefore, 1,000 years of our years is considered by God as one day of His, which is the first 6 days of creation. Therefore, every 1,000 years of us corresponds to 1 day of creation. First 1,000 years was the first day of creation, second 1,000 years was the second day of creation, and so on. Now, in other words, 1 day is equal to 1,000 years. When 5,000 years had passed, that is the same thing as saying that the 5 days had passed, which means that in that time, in the year 5,000, that was the beginning of the 6th day. Now we know that Erev Shabbos begins the 6th day. Therefore, the preparations for Shabbos, which is of course the Messianic era, begins in the 6th day, because we begin preparing for Shabbos in the beginning of the 6th day. Therefore, God begins preparing for the Messianic era, right, also in the 6th day, which of course is the year 5,000. That is what the Zohar means. Be'ez Hey, in the big time of the 5,000 years, which is equal to the beginning of the 6th day in God's time, which is equal, of course, to Erev Shabbos, and that's when you begin preparing for Shabbos, and therefore that is when the Or Mashiach begins to descend. Now that year was 1240. 1240 on the English calendar is equivalent to the year 5,000. And you will begin to see remarkable coincidences at that time. But remember, at that time, could you imagine that the Or Mashiach begins coming down? Right? Which is an incredible idea. In other words, the Kedusha that was coming down contained in it the knowledge of Messianic ideas, which is the Yichud of the Rebbeinu Shalom, and how everything can be reduced to the Yichud, or to ultimate principles. That's what began coming down. But wait a minute. If the Jews begin getting it, not because of their mitzvahs, but because the time demands that the Or Rishon come down, what happens if the Jews sin? Who gets it? The Satan. Which is an incredible idea. It comes out that the Or Rishon begins coming down in the year 1240 or the year 5000 because the time dictates it, because of Erev Shabbos. It comes out that if the Jews begin sinning, who begins taking that Kedusha, that Shefa? The Satan. Because he's yonik from us. So if we're getting this Or Mashiach, right, this Or Rishon, Be'ez Hey, if we do sins, then he is also getting this Or Mashiach, which is horrendous. Not only is he getting the Yichud, he's getting the Messianic Or itself. And that is the beginning of the explanation of why you see what is going on for the last 1,000 years. Let's take a look. The Zohar was discovered right around the time of 1240. Why? Because the Zohar is the metaphoric sefer, the sefer that describes the pnimius of the Bria. Okay? And that was discovered right around the year 5000. The beginning of the Messianic light. The Baya, the Sefer HaBaya, which is a Kabbalistic text, also, which is the pnimius of the Bria, the Or Mashiach in metaphors, because that's really what it is, in Mishalom, or metaphors. That's also discovered at that time. This is what begins happening at that time. Why? Because the Or Mashiach begins coming down as predicted by the Zohar itself, Be'ez Hey, in the beginning of the 5,000 years. The beginning of Erev Shabbos, the lights, the Messianic lights come down. The knowledge of Mashiach begins coming down. But wait a minute. The Jews sin. Therefore, the Satan is yonik. He begins grabbing the Or Mashiach. But if he grabs the Or Mashiach, then what happens? He takes the Messianic light, distorts it, and gives it to the Goyim. That is why you begin seeing a tremendous advance in the wisdom and knowledge of civilization. Because in 1240, around that time, Roger Bacon lived, who is the beginning or the founder of the scientific method. Science, if you ask yourself, what is science? Science seeks to explain physical phenomena. But how? Science realizes that all physical phenomena can be reduced to ultimate principles. That itself is a tremendous advancement in thinking. That the hundreds and hundreds of millions of different physical phenomena is not disparate or separate from each other, but that they are all related by common ideas. The concept of science is to reduce all physical phenomena to fundamental principles. Like Einstein, E equals mc squared, that energy is really mass, concentrated mass. That's a reduction. And that's really what they're trying to reduce today, all forces into the four fundamental forces. But science is a distortion of that principle. In other words, what the Or Mashiach does, it reduces all things to the fundamental idea of yichud. What science does, it reduces all things or physical phenomena, but it says that the ultimate causes of physical phenomena is physical, not spiritual. That's a murdig distortion that science does. But what do you want from the Satan? That's what he does. So what he does is he begins bringing down that chokhmah that the Goyim began seeing, the scientific method that tells them that reality is really has fundamental ideas which can explain all physical phenomena. But what he tells Goyim is not that there's a ruchniistige universe or that God is behind the whole thing, that the oneness of God is behind the whole thing. What he tells them is that physical phenomena, or rather that the answers or the physical principles that underlie all physical phenomena is physical. So it's part messianic because it's the concept that physical phenomena can be reduced to ultimate principles, but it's a tremendous sheker. In other words, it's the Or Mashiach b'derech tumah. It is the messianic comprehension in a murdiger, in a tremendous defiled way. Because science looks at it that the physical foundations of the world is physical, not spiritual, which is a corruption. It's a distortion of the concept that all things are reduced. But they say it's reduced to physical principles. And of course the Or Mashiach says it's reduced to the yichud of the Rebbeinu Shalom. That's what it is. Therefore, the Satan is Yonik, and right around the time that the Mashiach, that the Or Mashiach, the Or Rishon starts coming down, along appears Roger Bacon, who is the beginner of the scientific method. Now, all of a sudden, there's a race. The lights keep coming down. Therefore, there is a tendency of the Jews to approach the pnimius of Torah more and more. Therefore, you have the Kabbalists, you have the Ari. Why are all these things coming closer and closer? Because of the shefa of the Or Rishon itself coming down. But wait a minute, the Satan is being yonik that shefa. He is taking that for himself, and an incredible thing begins to happen. The year 1740 is the year 5500, which in the calendar of creation, the calendar of creation is equivalent to dawn or daybreak. In other words, daybreak happens in the year 5500. 5000 is what? Is nighttime of the sixth day. 12 hours later is another 500 years of 1,000 years. It's half. Therefore, 5500 is equivalent to dawn of the sixth day, where the light begins to spread, manifest itself. And that is equivalent to the year 1740. In the year 1740, there was supposed to be an enormous proliferation or expansion of this Or Mashiach because of the dawn of the sixth day, which is equivalent to the year of 1740, which is equivalent to the, of course, year 5500. So therefore, at that time, a decision has to be made. Who would this Or Mashiach go to? And again, it's dependent on the actions of the Jews. Now, there's a very interesting Kotzker. The Kotzker Rebbe said a very interesting idea concerning the Zohar. He said that in that time, there's a tremendous hashpor or messianic light that was supposed to come down. Either the Jews get it or the Goyim will get it. What was he referring to? Of course we know. Either the Jews get it if they do mitzvahs. If they don't, then the Goyim gets it because the Satan gets it. Because he gets those uris, those lights, those knowledges that we get. But since we're supposed to get the messianic lights, knowledge, then he gets the messianic lights. And that is why, right before 1740, you begin to see an awesome series of events in Klal Yisrael that again depicts the incredible inverse relationship that we have with the Satan. And what is that? Well, obviously the Jews lost out. because we obviously don't have that Or Mashiach. In other words, the sins of the Jews is what enabled the Satan to be yonik, to take the Or Mashiach itself, which comes down because the time dictates that it comes down. And as a result of that, he is able to take this Kedusha and use it for himself. So he is able to take the ois, the power from the Jews. And what happens? In 1648, there's the Khmelnytsky massacres, which destroyed 1/3 of the Jews of Europe. Most people don't realize how devastating that was. But 1/3 of Jews of Europe died in those massacres, which is incredible. Why? That is the ois, the power, the hatzlacha the Jews had, that went to the Goyim. And the Goyim, of course, used it to create an enormous pogrom, the Cossack Revolution. There you see the switch of the ois, and you should know that the Cossack Revolution, the Khmelnytsky massacres, rivals the Holocaust in proportion to the Jews that lived then. 1/3 of the Jews of Europe, and of course most Jews were in Europe. But how could that happen? And the answer is because he took the ois. What we're supposed to get, he got. Now, that is one thing he took. Another event which the Satan caused is a very strange phenomenon. At that time, in 1650, 1670, there lived a person called Shabtai Tzvi, who was the greatest false Mashiach that ever lived. He was an imposter through and through. But the question is, how did he have such enormous success? And the answer is very simple. Why? Because what gave Shabtai Tzvi his success was the Satan himself. What the Satan in effect is saying to the Jews is that you are really supposed to get the Or Mashiach, or the Mashiach. Instead, you will get the false Mashiach, which of course is Shabtai Tzvi. Not only that, so in other words, you are supposed to get the Messianic lights, the true Or Mashiach, around that time, because it's the daybreak of the 6th day, the daybreak of Erev Shabbos. To indicate that you will not get the Or Mashiach, that you have lost it, you will get Shabtai Tzvi instead. Not only that, but Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam, which indicates that the Or Mashiach went to the Goyim. The event itself indicates the pnimius of what occurred. And it's interesting that the Shabtai Tzvi event is what caused Jews to reject the pnimius of Torah, to reject the hashkafa in the Kabbalah, because they were afraid that whoever was learning that would be a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. So it comes out that the Jews themselves rejected the Orishan. They themselves removed it. And that is why the Baal Shem Tov had so much problems, because the Baal Shem Tov was trying to spread Hasidus, which essentially consists of a lot of the ideas of Ashkof and Kabbalah. Therefore, he was such a near-deaf. He was persecuted because once the Satan was taking it, and he had the power, of course, he could influence the Jews themselves to reject the Baal Shem Tov. That is why he had such terrible redifus. And that is also why the Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, had such redifus, because he was revealing the Messianic ideas. His Svarim reveal the interpretation of the Nimshal, the internal design of creation, and that is why he had to go through such terrible redifus. Because both of these people arrived, the Baal Shem, to spread the ideas, and the Ramchal to bring down these ideas, these Messianic ideas, or the ideas of the internal design of creation. They both suffered such terrible persecutions because since the Satan had access to that Or, because of the Chatoim and the Lashon Harah of Jews, therefore these people who were trying to spread it had tremendous persecutions. And of course, what happened? So the Satan got the ois, the power, and that is reflected through the Cossack Revolution, where 1/3 of European Jews died. The Satan got the Tiferes, the Chochmah. How? Because at the same time was born and lived the beginning of science, who is Sir Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton is the beginning of modern science. He lived at the same time of Shabtai Tzvi and the Cossack Revolution. Again, because science began in earnest at the same time Jews suffered such terrible persecutions, Jews had Shabtai Tzvi, and Jews themselves rejected the pnimius of the Torah, the internal design of creation. Isaac Newton, and that was the real beginning of science. Again, you see the incredible, the inverse relationship. You also see that history is understood when you understand the internal design of creation, because that's what moves history, and not what historians think. In other words, instead of us getting the Orishan more and more, the Satan took it. He used it. He took the yichud, not only the Shechina, but the yichud of the Or Mashiach, of the Orishan, which is a much greater yichud than the Shechina itself. It's a yichud of the Shechina, b'derech gevoya mi'oid. He took that yichud, he distorted it, and he gave it in the form of science. Because science realizes that all reality can be reduced to ultimate principles. But it's the Orishan b'derech tumah. It is a defiled and polluted Orishan, because scientists use it. They think that physical phenomena is understood by physical principles. Not only that, but they use it to distort truth. Darwin. That's why Darwin, again, was actually around the 19th century. Again, they use science and they distort it to in other words, what scientists say is that since we see that all physical phenomena is understood by physical principles, what do we need God? They don't believe in God. In other words, science itself promotes atheism because they feel that they can explain physical phenomena without recourse to the Rebbeinu Shalom. So it comes out that the Satan uses the yichud itself, distorts it, and science uses their knowledge to distort the truth and to promote atheism. And that is why there is a pasuk that we say in davening in the morning, Ad Mosai Uscho Bashvi. How long, and this is the classic pasuk, and this is what it really means. Ad Mosai Uscho Bashvi. How long will your ois, right, your power, Bashvi, be in captivity? Who is the captivity? In the hands of the Satan. V'sif'atcho bi'atzo, and your tiferes, your chokhmah, in the hands of the enemy. How long will your tiferes and your ois be in the hands of the Satan that uses it against us? That's why he is called the enemy. The pasuk reveals what is exactly going on. And that is why what's happening is because of the Lashon Harah of the Jews, the knowledge that is coming down, which is converted to science and converted to the power that Goyim have. That is why there are over 7,000 journal articles that come out every day, and knowledge is doubling every 5.5 years. That is why. Because as we get closer to the time of the year 2240, the ore comes out in a more intense form. Therefore, the Satan who is taking it is able to produce greater and greater science. That is why there's such an enormous rapidity of scientific ideas. Even scientists can't keep up with the amount of knowledge that's going on, because that's exactly what's happening. They have an enormous access to the yichud, not only of the Shechina, but the yichud of the Shechina in the form of the Mashiach, the Or Mashiach, in the form of the Orishan. That is what's going on today. But how is this caused? This is caused not by the sins of the Jews. It is caused by the Lashon Harah of the Jews. Because only the Lashon Harah gives him access to the yichud of the Rebbeinu Shalom, not the Chatoim. The sins cannot enable him to makatreg. It is the Lashon Harah that gives him the power of kitrug, which gives him the power of the shefa that the chet would give the Jew. It is the Lashon Harah that is removing the messianic lights, the Or Mashiach, from us. Therefore we see that if you don't speak Lashon Harah, you actually makarv the geula. You actually bring the redemption closer. Why? Because you bring the Or Mashiach coming down, as the Zohar says, because it's the 6th day, or 5,000 years, and it goes back to the Jews, which means that there will be an enormous amount of power, enormous amount of hatzlacha, an enormous amount of chokhmah in the pnimius of the Torah to the Jews themselves. And of course, the one who brings that will be the Mashiach. That is why he who doesn't speak Lashon Harah is truly Makarav the Gula, truly ushers in the Messianic time, the Yemos HaMashiach. And you understand it perfectly, because that's what's coming down. So instead of speaking Lashon Harah and giving him the Satan Kitrug and access to all that, or if you don't speak Lashon Harah, if you have Shmiras Halashon, of course, he cannot makatreg, he depletes and he dies, and of course we get it. Therefore, he thrives and grows, you should know, in our ignorance. We don't know what's happening. That's why I'm telling you, when you speak Lashon Harah today, it is not merely taking you to Bezdin and forcing you to go through punishment, you and the one who heard the Lashon Harah and the one who had spoken about. It's much worse. It's not only that the Satan hides the Yichud from the world and promotes evil. It's what's happening in the last 1,000 years is that he has access to the Yichud of the Shekhinah in the form of the Orishan. That's what we're giving him. So if we do not speak Lashon Harah, not only does he not have access to the Yichud of the Shekhinah, he does not have the access to the Yichud of the Or Mashiach itself. And by the way, the Holocaust indicates the switch in the Ois that he has. That's why, just like there's enormous intensity in science in the last 40 years, that would indicate that the Or Mashiach is coming down even faster, so he gets more Ois, which means he can get nations to kill us more, and that's why you have the Holocaust. That's one of the ideas why there's a Holocaust. Because that's his Ois. The intensity of that Kedusha coming down is more and more as we get closer to the year 2240. Therefore, his Chokhmah that he distorts is more. That's why there's an intensification of science, and that is why the Ois goes much more to the Goyim, and that's why you have a Holocaust. But it's because of the Lashon Harah of the Jews, that is what is doing it. Now that we understand this framework, we can now answer all the statements, the Mamor Chazal that I had brought previously. And let us see how it works out. Now, I had mentioned one Chazal that says, that rains are withheld because of those who speak Lashon Harah. And it also says that somebody speaks Lashon Harah, his livelihood is diminished. Well, now it makes perfect sense. Why is it that our livelihood is diminished? What is our livelihood? Our livelihood is where we derive nourishment. Of course, if you speak Lashon Harah, he has access to Kitrug. He then can haul us into court. He then takes the Yanika, the nourishment from our sins, and he eats. If he eats, we starve. In other words, the physical manifestation of him taking the Kedusha, him eating, is us starving. Therefore, rains are withheld, and our livelihood is diminished. It's perfect. That's exactly what happens. It's Midah Keneged Midah. You are feeding him by your Lashon Harah, which is giving him Kitrug, which is enabling him to derive sustain and derive nourishment from your Kedusha. Then it's Midah Keneged Midah. Your livelihood will be diminished, and your rains will be withheld. Perfect. There's an exact equation. That's one idea. That's one. That's two Chazals. We also understand why somebody speaks Lashon Harah does not receive the Shekhinah. Why is that? Again, because if you speak Lashon Harah and he puts you into court, it's not the fact that you are now being judged. It's not your punishment. It's the second dimension. That the Lashon Harah gives him Kitrug, which gives him the Yanika of your Chatoim, your sins, right? And he is able to have access to the Yichud to such an extent where he can master the Yichud, conceal the Yichud, and remove the Shekhinah. If he removes the Shekhinah, then Midah Keneged Midah, you will not see the Shekhinah. Since you allowed him to remove the Shekhinah, then you will not be privy to receive the Shekhinah. Again, perfect. Midah Keneged Midah. Because you enable him to mamish displace the Shekhinah. And therefore, since you allowed him to displace the Shekhinah, you will not be Zeicha merit to receive the Shekhinah. Again, it's a perfect Midah Keneged Midah. It's incredible. Once we understand the second dimension, the Chazals are so simple to understand. That's what happened. Okay? That is one. Another Chazal, anybody who speaks Lashon Harah, the Rebbe Shem says, I and he cannot live in the same world. Again, because the Satan gets the Yanika, because Lashon Harah gives access to the Kitrut, he gets the Yanika, right? And as a result of that, he can remove me from the world. So if you speak Lashon Harah, I and you cannot live in the same place because the Satan has access to the Yichud. He's able to master the Yichud of God, and therefore I must leave. You are enabling him to push me out of the world. Simple. Again, we see the Chazal is perfectly understood once you understand the total framework of Lashon Harah. We also understand another Chazal, that anybody who speaks Lashon Harah removes the Shechina, milamata l'mayla. In other words, he actually moves the Shechina. And again, we understand very simply, of course he moves the Shechina. Because when you speak Lashon Harah, he's mekatreg, he takes your kedusha, your shefa, hashpor, your connection to God, he's able to take it for himself, he has access to the yichud of that shefa, and of course he is able to remove the Shechina if the kedusha that is coming to you is the same kedusha as the Shechina. Okay? Therefore, when he's mastered the yichud of God, or he distorts the yichud, then the Rebbe Shalom must remove himself as a result of the power that the Satan has because of your chatoim. So again, that Chazal makes perfect sense. And of course, this also does, that God says that because of your sins of Lashon Harah, I have removed my Shechina. Again, because you have given him the power to be master the Yichud, therefore I have to remove the Shechina. But in the future, when I will take away the Yetzer Hara, and therefore you will no more speak Lashon Harah, then I will return my Shechina, because then of course there's nothing stopping it. Very simple to understand once you understand the entire framework. And we also understand why is it that Lashon Harah creates a defect in the Kisi HaKavod. Well, now you understand. Because since he can access the Shechina itself, the Yichud of the Shechina, then that's terrible. You are pogeya, you are defecting the Shechina itself. And even worse, the Satan is able to access the Or Mashiach, the Or Rishon itself, which is incredible. That's what it means, that because your Lashon Harah, the effects goes up to the Kisi HaKavod, up to the divine throne itself. That's how much power you give the Satan, that he can access the Yichud of the Shechina, and even the Yichud of the Shechina in the form of the Or Rishon, which is horrendous. And now you understand why the Vilna Gaon says in the name of the Medrash what the Medrash really means. That for every second that you don't say Lashon Harah, you will receive an Or HaGonuz that no Malach has ever seen. What does that mean? Especially in the last 1,000 years. Since he is taking the Or Rishon, if you don't give him the Or Rishon, you will get that Or Rishon. In other words, he, in the last 1,000 years, is taking, or in the last, certainly last 1,000 years, but actually longer than that, he is taking the Or Rishon, because that's what's coming down. And he has been accessing the Yichud of the Shechina in the form of the Or Rishon. Therefore, if you don't speak Lashon Harah, he cannot access that Or Rishon. Therefore, you will be zocher to that Or Rishon which you are giving him. So if you do not speak Lashon Harah, you will receive an Or Rishon that no Malach can comprehend as a result of Midah Keneged Midah. Now you understand why Lashon Harah destroyed the second temple. Because Lashon Harah gave him access to the Kedusha of Jews. It gave him access to the Yichud of the Shechina, and he was able to master the Yichud of God to such an extent where God said that he has a right to control the Yichud to such an extent because of the Lashon Harah, which revealed or gave him the Yanika of the sins of the Jews to such an extent that I must destroy my temple and I must leave. That is why it was destroyed. And also we understand why if you speak Lashon Harah, it's as if you deny deny the belief in God. Because when you speak Lashon Harah, and what does the Satan do? He is able to create or promote tremendous amount of concealment of oneness of God in creation. Well, what are you really doing? You are allowing him to create atheism and all kinds of evil and ideas which contradict the existence of God. So even though you yourself are not koifer beika, but it's ki'ilu koifer beika, because you are allowing the Satan to create situations in the world which clearly promote atheistic ideas or ideas that deny the existence of God. So it's as if you worship, or as if rather, it's as if you do not believe in God, which makes a lot of sense. Also, we understand an interesting Chazal, that Chazal say, Omar Kodesh Baruch Hu, the Baruch Shem said, Yovoi Nochosh, let the Nochosh, the snake, Shehischa b'Lashon Hara Tchila, who was the first one to speak Lashon Hara, let him come v'yipora, an exact payment, mimasapri Lashon Hara, from those who speak Lashon Hara. What does that mean? What that Medrash says is very simple. Let the snake come who spoke Lashon Hara first, and therefore, he therefore must wait for your Lashon Hara in order for him to get the kitrug. Let him come and exact his yanika from you who speak Lashon Hara, which is the only way he can get the yanika. The Medrash Mamish says it openly, but without this framework, how would you ever know what it says? And the last Chazal I want to mention is an interesting Chazal that is learnt in a totally different way. Chazal say that mit baroy, roy begezel, most people commit the sin, or the majority of people are caught in robbery and in stealing. Many people steal because they justify and rationalize it themselves. Mit baroyas, a minority are caught in acts of immorality, incest, adultery, and so on. V'hakol b'Lashon Hara. Everybody speaks Lashon Hara. Now, normally people learn that Chazal, what it means is this, that a minority transgress, or they're caught in the sin of immorality and so on, because people know it's a sin. A majority are caught in stealing because people rationalize and justify and say, well, it's my boss, he'll never know, he owes me anyway, and so on. A majority get caught in stealing. Everybody gets caught in Lashon Hara because it's so easy to commit. You just speak and it's, before you know it, you've spoken Lashon Hara. But the truth is, if you really want to think of this Chazal in its pnimius, it has another meaning. Why does everybody fall in the sin of Lashon Hara? Why does everybody transgress? You know? Because since Lashon Hara is the only way he has access to your kitrug, he will make sure that you will fall in Lashon Hara. He has no choice. The reason why everybody falls in Lashon Hara isn't because it's an easy sin. That's a superficial understanding. The reason why everybody falls in Lashon Hara because the only way he has access to your chatoim, your yinika, the yinika to himself, is if he gets you to sin in Lashon Hara. Therefore, he makes sure, he works overtime to make sure that everybody will speak Lashon Hara. Because Lashon Hara to him is meal, it's eating. If you don't speak Lashon Hara, then you shrivel up part of him. Therefore, he will make sure, in other words, the greatest chet that the Satan wants to do to you, to make sure that you will do, is Lashon Hara. Because it's not merely a sin. It is the only way he can survive. Therefore, every strategy that he can think of, he will employ to get you to speak Lashon Hara. Because it's without Lashon Hara, even if you have sins, he will not survive. Because without kitrik, he can't survive. He needs your Lashon Hara. Therefore, everybody speaks Lashon Hara because he makes it his business that everybody speaks Lashon Hara so he can survive. Which, of course, is a different way of understanding it. And of course, by the way, if we think of it, Baal Lashon Hara, the word Baal Lashon Hara, the numerical equivalent of Baal Lashon Hara, the gematria, is equal to Ein Mekabel Pnei Shechina. That if you speak Baal Lashon Hara, who speaks Lashon Hara, Ein Mekabel Pnei Shechina, he does not receive the face of the Shechina because that's what he drove away as a result of the inverse relationship. So that reveals the second dimension. And it's also gematria Hanocha Shel Adam Chava, the snake of Adam and Chava. In other words, that you arouse the snake of Adam and Chava to Mekatrig. And that reveals the first dimension, that the only way he can be aroused, the only way you can interface with that nochash is by speaking Lashon Hara. That's the only way he can Mekatrig. So the Gematria itself, interestingly enough, reveals two different statements. Ein Mekabel Pnei HaShechina and Anocha Shel Adam V'Chava, which illustrate both dimensions. What do we see from this entire discussion? An enormous truth that there are two ways God deals with your sins. If you speak Lashon Harah, then you must go through Mishpat. And the Satan has access to Kitrut, Midah Keneged Midah, and therefore you must stand in trial. But the Satan doesn't do it merely to entice you, merely so you should get punished, which happens anyway. He does it because, of course, survival. So we see an enormous idea that if you don't speak Lashon Harah, he will die even though you have Chatoim. And in Bizman Hazeh, in 1987, what he really is getting is the Or Mashiach. That is why science proliferates to such an enormous extent, and that is why the Holocaust was able to occur. Okay? That is why it is so urgent not to speak Lashon Harah. I have spoken many ideas now, ideas which most people have never heard of. Why? Because the reason why he is winning and dancing on our heads is because we are ignorant of what our Lashon Harah does for him. It is time that Jews understood and not be afraid to look at the Pnimius HaTorah, to look at the internal design of creation. Don't run away from these ideas, because your ignorance means your death. That's exactly what's happened to Jews in the last 1,000 years. Your knowledge means his death. Therefore, you cannot run away. You must know these ideas, review them 1,000 times in order not to speak Lashon Harah. And the benefits of Shmiras Halashon, not speaking Lashon Harah, is not only do you not get judged, and if somebody speaks Lashon Harah about you, you will not get judged as Ayin Hara, but you will save the world, you will bring back the Shekhinah, you will bring back the Or Mashiach to the Jews instead of the Satan getting it. Now, what I'd like to do now is go into the area, a very strange area, and that is the idea, or that portion of the Torah which talks about Negoim, or Tzoras. Now, in Vayikra, in the Torah, it talks about what seemingly is some kind of a disease called Tzoras, or Negoim. Now, what is important to know is that Tzoras is not a true physical disease. It wasn't an actual clinical pathology that a person had, but rather it was some kind of a skin discoloration. It was some kind of an unnatural skin color. In other words, the skin assumes various unnatural shades of color. That's what Tzoras was. And if you had some kind of an unnatural shade of color, shades of white or whatever on the skin, then this was a symptom of Tzoras. And if you did have Tzoras, in other words, if you were a Metzora is one who had Tzoras, then you were rendered Tomei. Tomei, of course, means that you were defiled, or you were spiritually unclean. Not physically unclean, but spiritually unclean. In other words, you could defile or make spiritually unclean men if you touch them, vessels, food, or drink. You could actually make them Tomei or defile them, and you yourself, of course, were defiled. You were Tomei. This is if you were Metzora, in other words, if you had Tzoras. Now, if you were Metzora, you could not come in contact that was holy. For instance, you could not eat of sacrifices that were offered in the temple. You couldn't even walk into the temple if you were Metzora. This is the practical application, of course, if you had Tzoras, if you were a Metzora. But what's important to remember is that Tzoras is not a physical disease. It's really some kind of a skin discoloration. If a person had that, and he had the proper signs of it, the symptoms, then he would be called a Metzora, one who had Tzoras, and he would be Tomei. Now, one of the peculiarities of a Metzora, one who had Tzoras, was that he had to be isolated from society. He had to be Yeshiv Bodod, to be isolated, to sit alone outside of the camp of Israel. Now, when you look at English translations of the Torah, you'll see that they refer to it, Neged Tzoras, as a plague of leprosy. That is a distortion. It is not true. Tzoras is not leprosy. The reason why the English translators confused it with leprosy is because he who had Tzoras, he who was a Metzora, had to remain isolated or had to be quarantined outside the camp of Israel. He could not be amongst where people resided. Therefore, people imagined that just like leprosy, you had to be isolated from society. They equated tsaras with leprosy. They thought that since tsaras has to be isolated, and leprosy, a person was isolated, therefore tsaras is leprosy. That is false. Tsaras was not leprosy. Rather, we would say that neged tsaras means a mark or an affliction of tsaras. And tsaras is some kind of a skin discoloration that appeared on the skin. This gives us certain definitions which we now can begin to work with. Now, what exactly does the Torah indicate about tsaras? Well, let's take a look at various chazal. And we will see that tsaras itself is very mystical. Chazal say that Kol HaMesapar Lashon Harah, anybody who speaks Lashon Harah, Negoim Boim Olov, he is the recipient of Negoim, or Negoim is another name for afflictions, it's another name for tsaras. In other words, anybody who speaks Lashon Harah, he gets tsaras, he becomes a metzera. And actually it's indicated in another Chazal where it says, Zeis tia teres ha-metzera, it says in the Torah, this will be the law of the metzera. Al tikre ha-metzera, do not read, this is the law of the metzera, read, this is the law of ha-metzera, and there's a play on that, ha-meiti shemra, he who issues a false report on somebody else. In other words, he who speaks Lashon Harah. So we see according to this Chazal, that the connection between Lashon Harah and tsaras is biblical. That the Torah itself alludes to the fact that if you speak Lashon Harah, you get tsaras, you become a metzera. The question, of course, we must ask is, what is the connection? Why is it if you speak Lashon Harah, do you get tsaras? What does one have to do with the other? That's the first question we want to ask. The second question is that it says, Kol HaMesapar Lashon Harah, anybody speaks Lashon Harah, Negoim Boim Olov, Negoim come upon him. We can ask, why does it say Negoim tsaras comes upon him? It should just say Ne'enash b'tsaras, that he suffers or he is punished with tsaras. What do you mean somebody who speaks Lashon Harah, Negoim descends or comes upon him? That's a very unusual kind of expression. It should just say anybody who speaks Lashon Harah, he will be afflicted, he will be punished with tsaras. Instead, the Chazal use a different kind of expression, a rather odd expression. There is another Chazal, which really doesn't make sense when you look at it, which is extremely mystical. It says in the Midrash Tanchuma, V'chein ato meitzi b'nochash hakadmoni, and you will find by the nochash hakadmoni means the primeval snake, the first snake. The snake, of course, by Adam v'Chava, the one who tried to entice them, is called the nochash hakadmoni. It says there that V'chein ato meitzi b'nochash hakadmoni, and you will find by the nochash hakadmoni, that original snake, Al Sha'oma Lashon Harah Borei, since it spoke Lashon Harah on God, as we had mentioned before, that when it talked about when the Nochash tried to entice Chava to eat from the tree in Adam, it used the argument that God Himself got His powers from the tree, and that's why He told you not to eat from it, because He doesn't want you to be the same as He, and that was pure Meitzi Shemra, because of course it was a lie. He was defaming, denigrating God, and not only that, he was lying. He said that God, of course, derives his power from the tree, which of course is false. So the Medrash says that you will find by the Nochash HaKamoni, because he said Lashon Harah on God, Lefikoch Nitzareah, he got tsaras. God afflicted the Nochash, the snake, with tsaras. That's an incredible statement. First of all, the reason why it's so difficult to understand is the only ones who can get tsaras is either man, houses, or clothing. This is what it says in the Torah. So how in the world is it possible that a snake gets tsaras? This is incredible. That's the first question. The second question is that the Nochash HaKadmoni was the Yetzer Hara. What does it mean that the Yetzer Hara got tsaras? That's incredible. What does that mean that it got tsaras? And we can also, in other words, how does a Yetzer Hara get tsaras? What is that supposed to mean? Is he punished with tsaras? The way man is punished if he speaks Lashon Harah? It doesn't even begin to have an understanding. And also we can begin to wonder, how does the tsaras manifest itself on the Nochash? What does all this mean? Obviously, Chazal are aware of something, the connection between tsaras and Lashon Harah, which is totally removed from us, totally concealed from us. They understood the pnimius of tsaras, because they understood the pnimius of Lashon Harah, and they were able to connect the two, because the Torah reveals the connection. We have to, of course, wonder what is that connection. But in some way it's revealed through this Chazal. Again, it says also in the Midrash, Shema piv uleshonoi, shema mitzoras nafshoi. It says a pasuk in Mishlei that he who guards his tongue and his mouth from speaking Lashon Harah, shema mitzoras nafshoi, guards himself against troubles that will come upon his soul. Now the Midrash says, Al tikrei mitzoras nafshoi, ela mitzoras nafshoi. The Midrash says, he who guards, in other words, the Midrash says, read the pasuk this way. He who guards himself from speaking any kind of Lashon Harah, he also guards himself, or he prevents from occurring troubles, or rather tzoras, on his soul. In other words, instead of reading mitzoras nafshoi, he guards himself from the problems of his soul. It says, read mitzoras nafshoi. If you don't speak Lashon Harah, he guards against the tzoras that comes upon his soul. What does that mean? It should say from the tzoras that comes upon his guf, its body, because tzoras was some kind of skin discoloration that occurred in the flesh, in the skin of the flesh. What kind of tzoras lies on the soul? What does that mean? This again is also a question which we have to try to understand. So therefore we begin to see that Chazal are really very difficult to understand, and somehow they connect it into a framework which we are not aware of. Now, what have we seen so far? That Lashon Harah permits kitrug, an accusation by the Satan, on all sins of that individual. And this, of course, provides yanika, or nourishment, to the Satan from the kedusha that would have flowed to that individual. Instead, that kedusha flows to the Satan. And of course, the Satan gets the kedusha from all the sins that he can accuse. So we see therefore that it provides, the Lashon Harah provides the yanika to the Satan from the kedusha flow that would have gone to the Jew had he done the mitzvah. Instead he did the avera, the chet, the sin. Therefore it goes to the Satan from all the chatoim that the Satan can accuse this individual of, which basically is all of them, since he spoke Lashon Harah. What that does, it gives to the Satan tremendous oiz, or power, success. And of course we know that the effect of that, of course, is tremendous tigbar sarah, which means that there's a tremendous proliferation of evil. Evil grows, therefore it's able to be master the yichud of God, to conceal the absolute oneness of God, which I had spoken about. And this, of course, removes the Shekhinah, if that's what's coming to the Jews, or it distorts the yichud to the world, or it actually distorts the Or Rishon, or the Or Mashiach itself. I had mentioned this previously. Now, what are the Tikbar Sarah effects on the individual who generated it? What exactly was, what were the effects or the consequences of the Tikbar Sarah for that individual who caused the Tikbar Sarah? Well, what happened is that the Satan was able to issue forth a tremendous amount of tumah or zoyamah. Now, tumah means defilement. Zoya means pollution or defilement also. The Satan was able to issue forth a tremendous amount of tumah or zoyamah that surrounded the soul of the individual who spoke Lashon Harah or who heard Lashon Harah. Now, what does zoyamah really mean? It's like a control cable. In other words, if the Satan can spread you with zoyamah, it's like its own venom. It can pervade you with its own venom, which means that it has a tremendous amount of control over you. It's like an octopus with its tentacles. The octopus is able to send out its tentacles and therefore control things within its reach. When you did a chet, if you spoke Lashon Harah and it was Tikbar Sarah, the Satan was able to send out its tentacle, which we can use as an example, which was called zoyamah, tumah, and that was able to control you. That tumah or zoyamah surrounded your nefesh and was able to control you. That pollution or defilement surrounded the soul. And the control that the Satan had on you manifested itself in various ways. One of the ways is that your drives to sin, the drives that you had for pleasure or whatever, grew worse. A second way is that the Satan was able to force you to go into worst tempting situations, worst nisyonos, where you would be tempted even further or even greater as a result of the fact that you sinned on a lighter temptation. And the worst thing that the Satan was able to do to you, because he surrounded your soul with Zoyama, his Tumah, his venom, was he was able to occlude, to withhold the Kedusha that would have come to you, that Yichud, that presence of God that would have come upon you had you done a mitzvah. If you do an Avera and you speak Lashon Harah and he's Mekatreg, then he's able to take the Kedusha flow away from you and he's able to use it on himself. And that is what causes Tigbur Sarah. The occlusion of Kedusha to the Nefesh, which denies it its power, the soul's power, or denies it the Yichud itself to the soul, that the Satan was able to take for itself and use it against the world and against the person himself. This is the results, of course, of the Tigbur Sarah. Now, what is important to understand as a result of the concept of Tigbur Sarah is that Tigbur Sarah generates one of four existential states of evil. There are four kinds of states of evil which result from the fact that the evil proliferates. Now, the first state of evil is called confusion. That kind of a state exists when there's a tremendous mixture of evil and good in the same environment. And it's very confusing. It's hard to discern or distinguish between good and evil. There's evil and good in one person. There's evil and good in the environment. Evil and good exist simultaneously in the same environment. That's the first existential state of evil that could be created as a result of the Tigbur Sarah. The second state of existential evil that could be created was called a state which is devoid or empty of good. In other words, the environment is only evil. That is a second existential state that could be created as a result of Tigbur Sarah, which was, of course, generated by your Lashon Harah. The third state the third existential state of evil that could be created from your Lashon Harah through Tigbur Sarah is the state which is called an alternative rational system of evil. In other words, it wasn't just the fact that the environment was evil or a nation was evil. What happened was that nation actually had a logical philosophical system to justify the evil that they did. That was a rational system of evil. Evil was justified. Evil was actually rationalized through a comprehensive approach through logic and through philosophy itself. In other words, evil made sense in that environment. That was the third existential state of evil that the Satan was able to generate as a result of the Tigbur Sarah it got through your Lashon Harah. The fourth existential state of evil is the last and the worst. It is when the third state is completely comprehensive or pervasive throughout the world and has tremendous intensity. In other words, it is when the framework, the alternative rational system of evil, is generated or pervades throughout the entire world. It's tremendously intense. All nations are evil and they justify the evil. It is no more restricted to one locale. It is no more local in nature. It is now international. That was the fourth existential state of evil that you could generate through Lashon Harah via Tigbur Sarah. Those are the four states of evil that you could actually create. Confusion or mixture of evil and good, emptiness or only evil, pure evil, an alternative system of evil, rational, where evil is rationalized through a philosophical system, or the intensity and proliferation of that evil system throughout the entire world. Those are the four states of evil that could be generated as a result of the growth of evil. Now the Torah actually alludes to these four states in the first or the second pasuk of Bereshis. The Torah says, and the earth was tohu, vohu, v'choshech ha'pnei sahim. The Torah says that when God created the heavens and the earth, He created the earth. The earth was what's called unformed. It was in a state of tremendous confusion. Things did not have the boundaries that they're supposed to have. Vohu means empty. There was an incredible amount of vast emptiness that was on the world. Choshech, it was completely dark. And Tahoim, it was covered with a deep abyss or a tremendous oceanic expanse. It was an ocean, waters that covered the earth. These four expressions really refer to the four existential states of evil. Now, the first, of course, which is tohu, confusion, refers to the admixture of good and evil. Good and evil predominate together, therefore there's a state on the earth of tremendous confusion of mixture. The second expression that the Torah uses, which is voyu, emptiness, means emptiness of good, only evil predominates. The third expression the Torah uses is called choshech, or darkness, and of course that darkness is in reference, that darkness refers of course to the alternative rational framework of evil. And the reason why it's called darkness as opposed to the light, because it says then God said let there be light, and there was light. And we know that light is really the messianic light, the Orishim. What that light really meant is the light of the Yichud, where the ultimate cause of all reality will be clearly discerned, and that is the Yichud of God Himself. Therefore, if evil has a rational framework which justifies itself, that is called choshech, darkness, as opposed to the light. The light is the rational framework, the true framework, which is the Yichud of God, and darkness is the opposite, contrary, diametrically opposed system of evil, and that's why it's called darkness. Therefore, Tohim, or rather choshech, is called darkness, refers to the alternative rational system of evil. And the fourth expression the Torah uses is called Tohim, which is deep, the deep abyss. The waters covered the earth. Why? Because just like the alternative system covers the entire planet, all nations are pervaded with this evil system, the alternative rational system of evil. Just like the waters, which are dark, because there is no light in the waters, just like the waters cover the earth, this alternative rational system also covers the earth. This is what is meant so far by, rather the Torah alludes to these four existential states of evil, which you yourself could create through the Shmiras Halashon as a result of your sins, which of course the Satan had access to those sins, or the Kedusha flow from those sins because of the Lashon Harah which you generated. Now, I have now identified the four existential states of evil which the Torah itself alludes to. Now, there's an interesting medrash that says that each of these states of evil really, or rather, each of these states of evil which are represented by the four words of the Torah in Bereshis really refers to each one of the four empires that subjugated Israel. Toyu refers to Bavel, Babylon. Voyu refers to Poras or Persia, Choshech refers to Yovan or Greece, and Tohim refers to Rome. These are the four empires that subjugated Israel. These are the four empires where Israel had to go into exile under. Now, what is the connection? Very simple. What happened is that each of these existential states of evil actually was manifest or expressed in one of the kingdoms. That's what it meant, that each of the terms that the Torah uses to refer to the four existential states of evil refers to the kingdom. What it really means is that the kingdom itself had the existential state of evil. Therefore, Toyu, which was Bavel, had the existential state of evil, which of course is confusion. Why? Because what was Babylon? Babylon was a very spiritual country. They were steeped into kishuf, or magic. And if you take a look at Daniel, you could see Nebuchadnezzar himself believed in God, or in the fact that the spiritual universe is the cause of the physical. But the problem with Babylon is they were steeped into kishuf, tumah, and they were steeped into idolatry. In other words, there was a mixture. There was good and bad. Good means that they believed that the physical world is generated by the spiritual universe. The spiritual universe is the fundamental principle of the physical world. But instead of believing in the oneness of God, they believed in kishuf, and they believed in, of course, idolatry. Therefore, Babylon was an existential state of evil that was tremendously confusing. It was spiritual and idolatrous at the same time. Paras is Persia, which is referred to as Vohu, emptiness. Paras was basically pure evil. There was no real spirituality in Persia. Witness the fact that Haman and Achashverosh wanted to destroy the Jews totally. Persia was an evil Medina. There was hardly any real good in Persia. Therefore, Paras is referred to as Vohu, emptiness, because the existential state of evil that existed in Vohu was in Persia, which of course means basically pure evil. Yovan is Greece, is the first time we begin to encounter a system of logic, philosophy, and science that would actually explain evil. In other words, Greece provided a rational, fundamental basis of the world. That's why Yovan or Greece was called choshech, which is darkness. In other words, they said that the ultimate cause of the universe is physical, not spiritual. Therefore, they provided the rational framework. They actually had the existential state of evil, which was a tremendous philosophical and rational framework that explained evil, that explained why the physical basis of the world is not spiritual, but rather based in logic. It is physical. Therefore, Yovan, Greece, is called choshech, darkness, as opposed to the Orishim. Because the Orishon, which God said, let there be light, means the Orishon. That, of course, means that spirituality, or the spiritual universe, is the basis for all physical phenomena. They said that the physical universe is the basis for all phenomena, therefore they are called choshech, darkness, as opposed to that light. And of course, Tohaim was called Rome. Why? Because Rome did not initiate or innovate anything new on its own. It merely was the bearer of Greek civilization. That's what Rome contributed to the world. They are the ones that really started Western civilization, because they spread the teachings of Greece, the philosophical system, the logic, the alternative rational framework of evil of Greece. Rome spread throughout the world. Therefore, Tohaim is characterized as Rome, because the fourth existential state of evil was in Rome. Now, these four states of evil, which are manifest in these four empires, how are they created? The truth is that they were generated through the sins of Jews because of Lashon Harah. In other words, the Satan had access to the sins of Jews as a result of the Lashon Harah that they spoke. As a result of that, he was able to grow Gvura Sarah, Tigber Sarah, he was able to grow. And that growth manifested itself, expressed itself in four existential states of evil. And each state was given to one empire. In other words, Jews themselves created through the Lashon Harah that enabled the Satan to access their sins, the Kedusha, the holiness of their sins, and take it for himself. Jews created the Tigber Sarah. They created the four existential states of evil that existed in these four different empires. Now, the task of the Jew is now what? The task of the Jew is to remove this Kedusha, this holiness, this power that the Satan has as a result of their Lashon Harah, to take it back from the Satan and bring the Kedusha, the holiness, the success, the ois back to the Jews, and the teferes, the yichud, back to the Jew. How does he do that? The Jew must then go into these four empires, reside in them, and remain righteous. When he does that, then the kedusha goes back to him. It weakens the power of evil to create the existential states of these empires, and then the empires die. That is why they disappeared, because the Jews went through those countries and remained righteous, or suffered at the hands of those countries. They removed the kedusha of the Satan back into the hands of the Jews, and as a result of that, the ois, the power of the Satan, and his teferes, the yichud, which he's able to distort and give those nations, it disappeared. In other words, what they did is they obliterated the existential states of evil found in each of these, of course, exiles, as a result of the fact that the Jews went into them, they were exiled to them, and they remained righteous or suffered at their hands, and as a result of that, they were able to obliterate these existential states found in these four empires. That is the secret, by the way, of the exile in the four empires. In other words, to vaporize, to obliterate the existential states of evil, which are expressed in these four empires, which have been created by the Lashon Harah of the Jews themselves. And of course, the Satan has access to the yanika of the sins as a result of the Lashon Harah of the Jews, and therefore has Tigber Sarah and is able to give that or create the existential states of evil and manifest them in four different empires. That is the secret of Golus, where the Jews must go into those empires and reside in them, remain righteous or suffer, and take away the Kedusha that powers the Satan, which powers the existential state which exists in those four empires. In other words, to divert the divine flow of power and yichud back to the Jews and back to the world. What do we see so far? That what Lashon Harah does, it allows kitrug or accusation to occur, which yields mishpat, which yields judgment against the person. This provides, besides judgment to the one who told the Lashon Harah, the Masapa, the one who listened to the Lashon Harah, Shomea, and the subject, the one they talk about, but it provides yaniko, nourishment to the Satan through the sins, of course, which is of course revealed as a result of the Lashon Harah. This creates enormous Tigber Sarah, and we saw that it creates it in one of four possible existential states of evil. And of course, the parameters of Hesti Yehuda, the concealment of the oneness of God, manifest themselves in one of these four states. We also see what Lashon Harah does, is that it enables Tumah, or the Zoyama of the Nachash, of the Satan, to envelop the Nefesh, the soul of the individual himself. And the amount of Zoyama that envelops the soul is proportionate to the Tigber Sarah which the individual created. In other words, the quantity and the quality of the Zoyama is actually proportionate to the Tigber Sarah that the individual created as a result of the Lashon Harah. that Zoyma which surrounds the Nefesh. Now, the Rebbeinu Shalom performed a tremendous chesed to the person. Why? How would a person know the consequences of Lashon Harah that which he created? How would he know the outcome or the effects of the Lashon Harah? How would he know of the Tigbur Sarah that he created? How would he know what kind of Tigbur Sarah, what kind of existential state he created? And we see that the Zoyma, of course, is proportionate both qualitatively and quantitatively to the Tigbur Sarah which he created. Now, how would he know? So what the Rebbeinu Shalom did is something incredible. He created a physical indicator, a barometer or a sign in which a person can perceive the Tigbur Sarah itself. In other words, the Tigbur Sarah which he created through his Lashon Harah would be revealed to him. Not only that, but the kind of Tigbur Sarah, the existential state of evil that he created, would also be revealed to him, and therefore he could do tshuva. So what the Rebbeinu Shalom did is he created a physical manifestation of the Tigbur Sarah itself, and the kind of Tigbur Sarah that this person created through Lashon Harah, and therefore the person could do tshuva on what he created. And that is the secret of Negoim, that is the secret of Tzaras. Very simply, the affliction of Tzaras which the person received was the very physical manifestation of the Tigbur Sarah itself, the growth of evil itself, which he himself through his Lashon Harah had created. The Tzaras thus served him as an indicator of the existence of this Tigbur Sarah, so he could do tshuva and undo this Tigbur Sarah which he himself had created through his Lashon Harah. The Rabbi Shalom created the physical phenomena of Negoim or Tzaras to serve as an indicator to the person that he has generated an enormous amount of evil and power to the Satan through his Lashon Harah. Why did the Rabbi Shalom provide this physical sign, namely Tzaras, for the sin of Lashon Harah especially? The reason is because only Lashon Harah enables the kitrug to occur and the Satan to grow in power. Without Lashon Harah, even if a person had thousands of sins, there simply is no kitrug, no accusation, no judgment, no unique nourishment to the Satan, and consequently, no growth to his powers and his abilities to promote Hesti Yechudei, the concealment of the oneness of God, which is the true definition of evil. Therefore, Lashon Harah, in light of this, is the worst sin that you possibly can commit. It therefore needs a unique physical indicator to the person so he can do tshuva or repentance and either undo or at least not continue to allow evil to grow. With this understanding of what Tzaras really is, we now understand a strange midrash. The midrash says that the four expressions in the Torah referring to Negoim or Tzaras, and these are Se'is, Sapahas, Baheres, and Neged Tzaras, really refer to the four empires that Israel is subjugated under. Se'is is Bavel or Babylon, Sapahas is Poras or Persia, Baheres is Yovan or Greece, and Neged Tzaras is Rome or Western civilizations. What the Medrash is really revealing is that not only is a nega an indicator of the Tigbur Sarah itself, created through Lashon Harah, but that the kind of existential state of evil one created through his Lashon Harah is also indicated in this kind of nega you had on your skin. Because each empire reflects or represents a particular existential state of evil that dominated it. Therefore, when it says that each kind of nega is comparable to one of the four empires, it really means that each kind of nega is comparable and truly represents one particular existential state of evil. Thus, when a Kohen looked at a nega on a person, he could see two things. One, that the person spoke Lashon Harah, creating an enormous Tigbur Sarah. Two, which particular existential state of evil his Lashon Harah had promoted. Both ideas were revealed by the physical indicator of Tzaras. All the questions asked previously are now simply answered through this conceptual understanding of Tzaras. The first question asked was, what is the connection or relationship between Lashon Harah and Negoim? We now see that Lashon Harah permits kitrug, accusation, which invokes judgment, which nourishes the Satan if the person is found guilty, which generates Tigbur Sarah, which envelops and surrounds the nefesh or soul of the individual who spoke Lashon Harah. In other words, it envelops this individual with tumah zoyama, defilement, which then manifests itself physically as saras or a nega on the person who spoke Lashon Harah in the first place. Thus, Lashon Harah ultimately leads to saras. The reason why it says that Negoim come upon him is that Negoim is a natural part of the sequence once a person speaks Lashon Harah, and is not some kind of external punishment given to the person. Therefore, Negoim comes naturally and automatically upon a person when he speaks Lashon Harah, and is not merely a punishment. The reason why it says that he who guards himself against Lashon Harah guards his soul from troubles, and we read it instead, guards his soul from tsuras, is because Lashon Harah creates Tigbur Sarah, which surrounds the soul with Zayama or Tuma defilement, which is tsuras, but on the soul, before it manifests itself on the body as Negoim. And the reason why the Midrash says that the snake or Satan got tsuras for his Lashon Harah does not mean that he literally got tsuras, because that can only occur on begodim, clothing, houses, or men. But rather the phenomena and concept of a physical indicator would now be applied to the Tigbur Sarah itself of the Satan, thus revealing to a person the consequences of his Lashon Harah, so he could do tshuva. Thus the growth and evil power of the Satan would be exposed to the one who generated it through his Lashon Harah, and he could do tshuva and destroy the Satan rather than promote its longevity. It is interesting to note that the Hebrew letters of tsaras, Tzadik Reish Ayin Tov, is really a combination of two words in Hebrew. Yotzas, which means to kindle a fire, and Ra, which of course means evil. Thus he who kindles evil or Ra gets the repercussions of this act by getting the physical indicator of this Ra or evil, namely tsaras. Also, Mitzera, which is a person who has tsaras, is also a contraction of two Hebrew words, Motzara, or in him who was found evil, which refers, of course, to the tumah in the zoyama. And of course, this occurred because the individual who spoke Lashon Harah received the zoyama as a result of the Tigbur Sarah he created as a result of the Lashon Harah. Therefore, he's called Mitzera, which means Motzira, that Ra, or evil, is found in him as a result of the Lashon Harah that he spoke. It is interesting to note also that the gematria, the numerical equivalent of the Hebrew words Ba'al Lashon Harah, he who speaks Lashon Harah continuously, is the same numerical value as the two Hebrew words Hanochosh, the snake, and Mitzera, Mitzera being spelled without a vav. And that is because one who speaks Lashon Harah, of course, arouses the snake or the Satan, of course, to Makatrek, to accuse you. And of course, you also are responsible for Tigbur Sarah, which of course manifests itself in you physically as Saras. Therefore, you are a Mitzera. Also, it's interesting that the word Ba'al Lashon Harah, the one who speaks Lashon Harah, also has the same numerical equivalent as Brias Hora, the creation of evil. Because I said before, when you speak Lashon Harah, you create Ra, you are responsible for Tigbur Sarah, which ultimately manifests itself in you physically.